For a long stretch of time, Sunday Night Heat represented something World Wrestling Entertainment once treated as essential, a secondary program that kept the machine moving between the bigger shows. It was not Raw, it was not SmackDown, but it mattered. It gave the company another hour of television, another place for talent to work, another outlet for storylines, and another reason for viewers to stay inside the company's world for a little longer each week. In that sense, Heat was more than a B-show. It was part of an older company philosophy, one in which secondary programming helped reinforce the larger brand instead of simply orbiting around it. That is why the disappearance of Sunday Night Heat is worth talking about. The show debuted in the summer of 1998, right in the middle of the Attitude Era, when the company had every reason to expand its weekly footprint. Later company retrospectives would describe it as a second weekly showcase, arriving during the heart of the Monday Night War, featuring major stars like Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, Sable, D-Generation X, and The Undertaker. That tells you how seriously the company initially took it. Heat was not created as an afterthought. It was created because World Wrestling Entertainment wanted more exposure, more inventory, and more ways to keep its audience engaged between major events. For a while, that model worked. Secondary programming served a very clear purpose. Heat gave the company another weekly stage during a period when momentum mattered. By the early 2000s, the company had expanded that approach even further. In May 2002, World Wrestling Entertainment announced a broader program lineup in which the Raw brand would be supported by Sunday Night Heat and Bottom Line, while the SmackDown brand would be supported by Velocity and Afterburn, with WWE Confidential added as a separate Saturday night brand-wide program. That lineup is revealing because it shows how the company thought at the time. Secondary shows were not random leftovers. They were built into the structure of the product, and that was the rise of secondary programming in its clearest form. Heat helped support Raw. Velocity helped support SmackDown. Confidential gave the company a place for a different tone, one that could lean into behind-the-scenes storytelling and personality-driven material. Together, these shows expanded the company's footprint and gave depth to the weekly product. They also gave younger or less featured talent somewhere to work, which mattered in an era when the company was still trying to maximize television presence across multiple outlets. Even later nostalgia pieces about Velocity frame it as a place where future stars and overlooked matches lived, which reinforces the idea that these secondary shows had real developmental and archival value, even if they were not the main attraction. But that same system also carried a built-in problem. Secondary programming works best when the company still needs it. Once the media environment changes, once the flagship shows become more dominant, and once the company finds new ways to distribute content, those extra programs can start to feel less essential. That is exactly what happened here. The first major sign came in the mid-2000s. Corporate filings show that, as of fiscal 2005, the company's Viacom cable agreement still covered Raw, Sunday Night Heat, Velocity, and the WWE Experience, which means those support shows still had a real place in the company's television business at that point. But the same filing also describes a new deal with USA Network beginning in October 2005 that would carry Raw and a one-hour weekend Raw-branded program instead. That shift matters. It suggests a move away from the older collection of support shows and toward a simpler, more tightly branded television package built around the flagship identity of Raw. That is really the heart of why Sunday Night Heat disappeared. It did not vanish because it had no history or no value. It disappeared because the company no longer needed that exact kind of program in the same way. The larger structure was changing. Raw and SmackDown had become stronger individual brands. Television deals were evolving, and the company was becoming more selective about what kinds of weekly programming it wanted to emphasize. In that environment, a show like Heat could go from useful to expendable without any dramatic farewell. The same logic helps explain the fading of other secondary programs. Velocity had its own identity, but it lived in the same category: supportive, useful, recognizable, but not central. Confidential offered a different kind of presentation, but it too belonged to a period when World Wrestling Entertainment was experimenting with how many distinct weekly television products it could sustain at once. Over time, the answer became clear. The company did not need all of them. It needed its biggest shows, its most marketable brands, and formats that could either drive stronger rights value or serve a more obvious strategic purpose. There is also a broader point about how wrestling television changed. In the Heat era, a secondary show could still feel important because there were fewer outlets, fewer streaming archives, and fewer digital side channels. A fan might genuinely need that extra hour to keep up with the full company picture. But as the media world expanded, the role of secondary programming started to shrink. Once highlights, recaps, archives, and supplemental content could live in more places, the old B-show model became less necessary. The company did not have to rely on a program like Heat to provide that bridge anymore. That does not mean Sunday Night Heat was insignificant. In fact, the opposite is true. It mattered precisely because it belonged to a moment when secondary programming still felt like part of the company's weekly backbone. Later company writing on the original NXT even described that show as the biggest cult classic since Sunday Night Heat, which says a lot about how Heat is remembered internally, not as a joke, but as a meaningful piece of company television history. In the end, the disappearance of Sunday Night Heat and the decline of World Wrestling Entertainment's older secondary programming came down to a shift in priorities. These shows rose because the company wanted more television, more brand reinforcement, and more places to showcase talent. They faded because the company's biggest brands became more self-sufficient, its television strategy became more streamlined, and the old support show model stopped feeling as necessary as it once had. That is the real story. Sunday Night Heat did not disappear because it failed in some spectacular way. It disappeared because it belonged to a version of World Wrestling Entertainment that needed secondary programming more than the later company did. And once that version of the company changed, the role of Heat changed with it.